considers the strategic targets are sufficiently defined and it is possible to attack them without at the same time directly attacking the civilian population, he would be justified in deciding that the action he'd been ordered to carry out was one that would not bring his conscience into direct conflict with the Church's teaching. Here the question is, what constitutes indiscriminate warfare? The same is true of the Church's teaching on contraception. Back in the 1960s and again in the 1990s, Roman moral theologians, without any rebuke or correction from the magisterium, approved the use of contraceptives provided they weren't abortifacient by women threatened with rape at a time of war. There was no doubt that real bombs or missiles were involved in the first case, nor that real contraceptives were to be used in the second case. But as the moralists pointed out, the Church's condemnation of artificial contraception applies to the marital act, not to acts of aggression carried out against a woman's body. To take one more example, thou shalt not steal may sound a very straightforward, absolute negative moral teaching, and yet the Catechism of the Catholic Church states unequivocally, there is no theft if refusal to give food to a penniless, starving peasant, for example, is contrary to reason and the universal destination of goods. One could, of course, give many more instances of apparently absolute negative moral teachings that do admit of exceptions or that do not apply in every apparent instance. There is, I think, a second response that Newman would make to this objection, which was made some years ago in an article published in a book I edited by Professor John Finnis of Oxford, who criticized Newman on this particular score. But I think there is Newman can indeed be defended, and I think what he says is absolutely true. So let me turn to the second response that Newman would make to the objection. The teachings of the Church do not speak for themselves any more than the Bible does. They require interpretation both as to their nature and their meaning. Not all teachings involve the exercise of infallibility. The degree of assent required of Catholics will vary with the degree of authority with which a particular teaching is invested. It also needs careful interpretation according to traditional theological norms. Newman was very emphatic that what he called the principle of minimizing should always operate, so that no more than was strictly necessary should be asked of the faith of Catholics. This principle of minimizing would take into account what Newman calls the intensely concrete character of the matters condemned in negative teachings. In other words, as we have seen, not all acts of ostensible theft or contraception, for example, fall under the condemnation of the relevant absolute negative teachings. So-called affirmative teachings, on the other hand, do admit of exceptions in their actual application. Thus, it is not always necessarily a morally good action to give money to a penniless beggar on the streets if it aids and abets his addiction to drugs. Finally, Newman notes that an absolute negative moral teaching such as that on usury may have to be modified in the light of changing circumstances, without, of course, abandoning the essential principle which will require reinterpretation and reapplication in the new situation. That's often brought up as an example of the Church. Of course, this has been a big debate about this. The American John T. Newman published a book some years ago, a few years ago, on can the Church change? And I think the reply made by the late Avery Dulles was perfectly correct on this one. The context for usury changed, but the Church still condemns usury, and it's still practiced in some parts of the world, in rural India, for example, where the teaching absolutely still does apply. But of course, in the West, where the whole economic situation has changed, although perhaps it's becoming more relevant now, the economic situation has changed so radically, of course, then the teaching has to be modified in the sense it doesn't apply to this particular new set of circumstances, because it isn't an act of usury any longer. In conclusion, Newman's theology of the conscience and his relation to the teaching authority of the Church upholds the sovereignty but not the autonomy of the individual conscience. The conscience is sovereign only because it is the vicarius of God, his substitute or delegate. But it is not autonomous because it is not a God, but the servant of God. The conscience is the spokesman not of the individual personality or temperament, but of God. Since a Catholic believes that God speaks through his Church, the Catholic conscience hears the echo of God's voice in the teachings of the Church. If they are affirmative or positive, the individual conscience must judge as to their applicability in the particular case. But even when they are absolute and negative, the conscience must decide whether a particular action in fact falls within the scope of the teaching. Both positive and negative teachings require careful theological evaluation and interpretation in accordance with the theological norms and traditions of the Church. Thank you for your patience in listening.